This is Impact Point, where we cut through the noise and get to the point. And here is your host, Rob Jenkins.
Well, Jake, hi there. Welcome to Impact Point.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be here with you.
You know, I could go through your bio, but we don't want to take up too much time, and that would take up all the time. But you really don't need an introduction. Starting out in the Navy, all the way now to the John Foster Dulles Professor for International Relations at Princeton.
Indeed.
That's almost as impressive sounding as the books behind you. Looks like you've published something like 150 or more articles, different publications, papers, chapters. You have a book or two under your belt. I think what's cool about you, well, one of the many things cool about you, is that you take on so many different disciplines. Sometimes it's conflict, sometimes it's economics, sometimes it's political affairs, sometimes it's development, monitoring, evaluation, all kinds of stuff. And what I find exciting is how you find the intersections between those different things, always pulling out something that is exciting. I'm not a big academic. In fact, I'm not one at all. But reading one of your papers is always worth its time. So thanks a lot for joining us and for a little conversation.
Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate the kind words. You know, when you do homework for a living and you do it for a long time, you produce a lot of material.
Well, a few weeks ago, you and I had a conversation and I asked you, so what are you thinking about these days? What's keeping you busy?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned right off, you said in one or two sentences, the term daguerreotype and epoch. I like the term epoch.
Right.
I used it in a podcast not too long ago, and people said that I should say epic because I'm not British, but I like epoch. So tell me about the epoch that has ended, and what does it have to do with the daguerreotype, and why should we care?
Yeah, happy to do so. I'm going to disagree with you on the pronunciation of epic, but it's okay. We're friends. We can disagree on things. So essentially what I think is happening is we're coming to the end of this weird historical anomaly that started about 1839 when the first daguerreotype is produced. And at that point, all of a sudden, and for the first time in human history, recordings became unusually strong evidence of truth. Right? We had this medium that was very hard to fake, that was high fidelity. And so if someone showed you a picture of a thing, it was probably a real thing that had happened in the world. They could obfuscate the context and other things, but the fact that that had happened was very well established. Over time, we got that with audio and then with video. And what that meant is that for a long time, the standard of proof we would look to in the media was not simply, do you trust the reporter? That was part of it, but a lot of it was like, do they have a picture of the event? Can they show you the video? And we would argue endlessly over what those videos meant. So we argue over the Zapruder film, endlessly, but we don't argue with the fact that what is in that film happened on that day in Dallas. That ethic is coming to an end, right? With the evolution of generative AI tools, it's increasingly possible to create high fidelity fakes of audio, video, historical documents, and other things. And so that evidentiary value of recordings is kind of going away. And so one of the questions that I think a lot about these days is what happens after recordings? When we move into this post-documentation world, what do we look to for evidence that something is true or not if we can't trust in these artifacts that we've lived with for the last, 180 years?
So what do we do?
So I think, Rob, the answer is we go back in time and we look to chains of reputation. So, back in the day, if you showed up in a new city and you wanted to bank with someone or you wanted to transact with them in business or be part of their social circle, you provided a letter of recommendation. And that letter of recommendation could be forged or faked, but the person who wrote it, in giving it to you before you left, was putting their own reputation on the line, their own business prospects, their own family prospects on the line. And that kind of worked at multiple layers. So I would trust Rob, who shows up in my city, because Rob came recommended by someone I could trust. And that person could be trusted because they had something to lose if their reputation failed, right? If you turned out to be a con person, it wasn't like I would suffer. And so I was very careful about who I would give a letter of recommendation to.
So what is the modern equivalent of a letter of recommendation?
It's a great question. So in that historical context, it's important to remember that those chains of reputation enabled all kinds of transactions over time and space that required very high levels of trust. So it sustained trade across the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages, where people were part of communities and they would trade with people who would go away for years and take huge amounts of value with them. And they didn't know for sure if they would come back. And if they came back with no cargo, they might say, oh, it was the pirates who took it, but you didn't know if they stopped at the port down the road along the way. And the thing that sustained that was that those people, if they were ever found to be shirking, would lose access to the whole economic network. So what does that look like in the modern era? It looks like media organizations having preferential distribution as long as they maintain a certain reputation for credibility. It looks like reporters or podcasters or influencers gaining preferential access to audience as long as they meet different quality criteria. Now, something we often lose sight of in the conversations about the online information environment is people get to choose what they pay attention to. And there's like an infinity of things to look at. Some people might choose to look at this podcast. Other people would look at other things. And what that does, though, is it creates a market for quality. For some set of people, knowing that the thing you're seeing represents reality with high probability has real economic, social, or kind of personal emotional value. And so they will be willing to pay with their time and attention and maybe money for things that meet a high standard. And so if you then want to gain access to that market, I think the way this is going to look is you're going to need to maintain a reputation for factuality, for not providing fake media, for providing context on the media you do provide. And that will then drive demand for organizations that can track those reputations in people and in content and in platforms.
What about people that don't really seem to care if it's real or not? I mean, I enjoy bunnies jumping up and down on a trampoline as much as anyone. But aren't there folks that just don't seem to care? They'll just believe whatever they're told to believe, or whether it's fake or not, they still like that news.
Yeah, of course. So I like to think of like different consumers here. And so some people might have real value and like they want news that's real. And so they're willing to pay for it. And other people, they just want to be entertained, or maybe they actually want news that caters to their ideological preferences because it makes them feel good, it validates them. There will be markets for both, I suspect, in the future. And the ones where people want to feel validation will probably not try very hard to sort out generated content. It won't matter so much to them because they don't care about that. As long as there are enough people who care, and I suspect there will be because there's economic value in it, then you'll be able to sustain these kinds of ecosystems where facts and evidence are maintained through those reputational mechanisms.
So is there a future for legacy media? It will survive?
I actually think the future for legacy media is fairly bright. And the evolution of podcasting is the thing that has really gives me hope. So why do people like podcasters as a source of political news? It's because you get to follow them for months and years and see how they talk about lots of issues. And you get to know their biases and how they spin different issues. And you can choose people who meet kind of the way you want to think about the world, the way you want to process facts. And a lot of that rests on the fact that they have a reputation they built up over time. And they know that if their audience feels they're being sold to or they're being presented with something, not because the podcaster believes it's a real important thing, but because someone paid them to do it, or someone tricked them into it, they're going to lose audience. And so the audience can count on what they're saying. That same kind of reputation adheres to legacy media. The challenge is going to be for legacy media figuring out ways to monetize that attention with less friction. Right? Paywalls were one attempt at that, but now like if I want to go to, I'm going to like reveal my ideological biases here, but like if I want to go to like the Atlantic and the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian, not so much the Guardian, but I want to go to Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, I don't know, Washington Post, Jerusalem Post, all of those are paywalled. Mm-hmm. And so I need to manage lots of different subscriptions. That's inefficient, that's tension, that's friction. And so we're going to have find some way to like make it easier for people to access those. But when they do, and they verify for example, that they're a real human, there's economic value in that for the publications, because that's differentiated attention compared to what might be agentic or bot activity that comes through.
Meanwhile, lots and lots of people are
Yes.
making money and or political gain, lying every day, and misinformation and disinformation, which is a whole different topic. But let me pivot now into places that mis and disinformation are rampant, and that's conflict and affected areas. You and I met, I believe, this is 15 more years ago, when you were working in Afghanistan, Pakistan. I was in the government trying to do what we now call social cohesion. That was we had a different phrase for it back then. Basically trying to make things better in bad places. And there was this huge impetus within government, at least within USAID, to prove what we were doing and attribute our activities to the results we wanted. And basically, in one way or another, this continued until, well, to this day, which is we want to do more to prevent conflict. And people say, well, you have to prove first that you're preventing conflict. You and I were engaged in conversations where I was grappling with this, and you basically, let me see if I got it right still. You can do discrete programmatic activities or political activities of any type. You can measure the direct attributive impact of that one activity, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4. But as you scale out geographically or over time in a complex environment, there are so many other variables that come into play that a lot of what you're trying to prove is not actually being proven. But people came up with things saying, oh, we want X to happen, so we did Y. And look, we got what we wanted. I saw a lot of really good programs in countries that did not go in the right direction. I also saw some really bad programs that took credit for things when they went right, and they shouldn't have been taking credit. So with all the years you've put into this, is it worth trying to prove that you're preventing things in a bad place? And if so, what's the best way to do it? Or when is it just, Smokey the Bear has been, for 80 years, the United States government has been putting money into Smokey the Bear. No one has proven how many forest fires have been prevented by that, but we believe it's enough to make sense of it. So what do you think? What should we focus on moving forward as we try to do things better in the future?
Can I make this even more complicated by pointing out
Please.
that it's not clear that preventing forest fires is the best way to prevent property damage?
Okay, let's not get onto that one.
So, like, there
we can do that
is
in another episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but there's an analogy here, which is like sometimes the thing you can affect doesn't have like the long run effect that you want. So let's use the example of large scale aid projects in Iraq, a place that I studied, that you worked on at different points in time. The United States and some international partners early after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 started pouring huge amounts of money into projects that were doing big infrastructure programs, trying to restart state-owned enterprises, things like that. And that was an effort to solve the problem of unemployment, which was seen as a contributing factor to participation in the insurgency and political violence. One of the big
those
things,
naive days, but continue.
those naive days, exactly, right? And there were many problems with that, like insurgency in Iraq wasn't a full-time activity, so you could do a day job and be an insurgent. They taxed the population, so you increased revenue in the population, and that gave them more money to work with. There were many problems with it. But one was it brought in a whole dose of corruption that caused people to question the government. And that's not unlike preventing forest fires for many, many years, but then you get a buildup of fuels. So when there is a fire, it's this huge unmanageable conflagration. So that's like one of the fundamental problems with proving what you're doing is working. So the solution to this is not to try and, I think, or this is the argument that my community has come up with, is not to try and prove that you're answering the global question, but that if you have a strong understanding of how the system works, you can move things where you can attribute effects in ways that are favorable for the overall outcome. So, for example, in some work I've done in Pakistan, that's on the development side of my work with colleagues at the Kennedy School, Asim Khwaja, and a group of fantastic Pakistani economists, Ali Chima, Farooq Nasir, we show that there are basically huge costs for women in rural parts of Pakistan to leaving their village. And so if you want to get programming out to women in these villages that help them with their education, with earning money, with business, with managing their kids, et cetera, you have to get the programming out to them. And because of the way we're able to evaluate the development programs, we can actually like measure the monetary cost of just crossing the imaginary boundary that exists at the edge of a village. And so someone who then has a theory that helping people, for example, learn to sew or learn how to provide better food for their young children is going to add value. That's a very concrete piece of knowledge that should inform how they design the program. But we can't answer, like, if you design programs so more women had education in this environment, would that globally improve welfare for women and their children? Because that runs through many, many other chains of interaction. And so I think we need to be humble about what we can prove with evidence, but also like a little bit less humble about our theories. Like, you spent a lifetime trying to make things better in hard places. You have a ton of knowledge about chains of causality that might lead to more or less conflict. What the evaluation community, I think, can contribute to that is like, okay, Rob, if you have like a strong belief about how this complex system works here, these are the three things that the evidence suggests you can move. And if you think one of those will move, here are the kinds of, like, will move your ultimate outcome. Here are the kinds of things that will move that. But we don't have the craft to understand that larger thing. There's not, I think in many ways, there's not anything better we have for that than the intuition of people who've been trying to solve the problem for their lives.
That's really helpful. Isn't it part of it is realizing that these systems are big, they're only partially understandable. So you find the three things that you know or you think will work, and then having the flexibility to go after those three things, because it might be very surprising and they're going to be different in every place. But then you build programs and you focus programs on what might not make the most sense in a one-pager, but make the most sense if you actually want to inject a positive sense of energy into that system, and then see what happens. And if you make a mistake, then you rearrange yourself, right?
Yeah. So in some ways, Rob, what you just described is like the approach that the software industry has taken over the last 15 or 20 years to building lots of the tools we use every day. This idea, Steve Blank and some others call it, customer development, but the idea is you get out, you identify some things, you bring them into the world, you see how they're working, you adapt and overcome, adapt and modify as you go. I think that's exactly the right process. And then we have to think about funding mechanisms that afford that flexibility. And you can think about accountability against large goals as being useful in that process, right? If you find that you're putting money into a place in a flexible way and over a number of years, things aren't improving, and globally, the factors that you think would influence the conflict are not moving in a strongly negative direction, then it's probably time to say, okay, we didn't understand the system well enough. The things that Rob and his colleagues thought would move it are not, and we should reallocate funds elsewhere. But that's not like the one slam dunk evaluation that proves it's not working.
Okay, with a few minutes left, you helped found ESOC, which is the Empirical Study of Conflict program. And you recently had your big annual conference in Washington, D.C.
Our 16th.
Congratulations on that. The world is in conflict. You study conflict. Any quick takeaways from that conference, or where all of you, well, first of all, what is ESOC, and takeaways from your conference?
Absolutely. So ESOC is an organization we started back in 2009. Colleagues, Joe Felter and others at Stanford, University of Chicago, UC San Diego, to try and connect people who were on the academic side that wanted to study conflict and ways to address it and reduce it and manage it, with people in government organizations, aid agencies, diplomats in the military, and NGOs and IGOs that were in the field trying to solve problems, to bring the social science craft to bear on the questions the operators had in a way that would inform both theory and practice. So it was like always our North Star is bringing these communities together to inform practice in the field and try and get better at solving problems in these places. And we have had, I think, a lot of success in moving both the academy over the years. So a couple years ago for our 15th meeting, I went through and like looked at publications in top journals in econ and poli-sci that use fine-grained data from different conflict zones around the world, and it's like night and day, like a 4x increase in the amount of attention the fields give to conflict and development, links between them, and the particular method of using variation down at the local level to understand what's going on.
That's
So
great. That is great.
that was a big win. There are some shibboleths of the aid community that you and I have talked a lot about over the years, like putting people to work will reduce conflict. That I think we played a role in killing.
It's
right?
still not dead. I've never met an ambassador that doesn't think the
It's-
answer to conflict is more jobs and more fresh water. But go ahead.
It's definitely not dead, but it is nothing like it was in 2009, where it was
Mhm.
driving like billions of dollars of US programming to go into like white elephant projects in different places. Like much less of that now, I think, hopefully. Um, uh, but fundamentally the idea was if you brought together social science craft with subject matter expertise, you could get research you couldn't get done from either side alone. And so I'll give you one of my two examples from our recent meeting, two things that stood out to me. The first was we had a conversation around how to engage policymakers, and one of our government participants gave a wonderful articulation of the cognitive habits of three bosses they had worked with and how they would bring social science research to each of those three kinds of bosses. And one was like basically you give them the standard like super short bluff TLDR kind of PowerPoint slide that we think about. A second one was you brief it and they're going to ask you questions for 30 minutes. And the third was you put it in their read book and they're going to underline it and come back to you. And so three very different cognitive styles, all interested in the content, but this person described how they had to convey it to each of the three. And that was a great lesson for the researchers in the audience to understand that before you go into those critical meetings, talk to the staff and understand what's the cognitive style of the people you're briefing so you can bring your game appropriate with the way they ingest information. So that's point number one that I thought was great. The second was we had a wonderful paper by a PhD student at Stanford, Alicia Chen, who's finishing up, on what was actually driving Chinese overseas development policy. And what there's a lot of concern and has been in DC for a number of years now about China trying to win friends and influence around the world by lots of development projects and building big infrastructure and whatnot. And it's often interpreted as a centrally directed thing aimed at winning over countries against the US or the West in favor of China. And there are many problems with that. But one is that actually a lot of the activity that gets lumped into that is driven by provincial decisions and provincial budgets in China.
Mm.
And what Alicia convincingly shows is that it is the governors who are up for one more promotion who drive a lot of that activity, because they know the overseas activity is favored in the center and it will help them get that last promotion. And the people who get the governor role after they're too old to get another promotion don't engage in the activity to nearly the same extent. So it's not some like centrally directed outward facing foreign policy effort solely. There's that motivation, but it's filtered through this bureaucracy that gives a ton of autonomy to the provincial governors. And that to me just puts a totally different gloss on where we see big Chinese development activity overseas and what that means for US foreign policy. And I think it's an exemplar of where you bring that deep subject matter knowledge together with social science craft, and you learn something very important about the world that can guide and shape how we engage as a country in the current geopolitical contest we're in.
Well, if anyone was looking for another example or a new example of why academics bring value to the practitioner, that is a wonderful example, because no practitioner would ever figure that out. It took someone very smart with the time and the ability to research, look at a lot of different things and pull that out. On cognitive styles, there's always the boss that no matter how much you write, you end up briefing them in the car on the way to the meeting. And you better make your 3 points quickly and make them clearly. Which brings us to the end, which we like to have impact points at the end, which is, Jake, do you have 3 points that people should take away from this conversation? And or it can be something completely different, but you want people that are listening or watching this to be thinking about in the near future.
Rob, that is like a really heavy charge, but let me do my best on this.
I failed it on my last podcast, but go for it.
Okay, awesome. I'll do my best. So the first is when you think about the way new technologies are going to influence the way people consume information and how our politics work, think about consumers making choices about where to spend their time and energy. Just because a thing can be done doesn't mean it will be done to big effect. And we could talk for hours about examples of that. The second thing is because you can measure some things, just doesn't mean you can measure all the things. And so be humble and thoughtful about where evidence can inform your thinking on both policy matters and big decisions, but also, the small ones in your life. Sometimes you have to go with values, and that's fine because the evidence, like it's a question about which there's no evidence. And then the third is to just encourage people to try and be voracious consumers of information. As crazy as the world seems right now, there are all kinds of bright spots out there, and the more you read, the more you'll find them. And that will make you feel much better because no matter what your political or social orientation right now, there's lots to be upset about. And so finding those bright spots is just is a great balm when you're feeling down.
My takeaway of your takeaways is be humble and thoughtful, and you're still allowed to watch fake videos of rabbits jumping on trampolines.
Cats on trampolines only, Rob.
Yeah,
No rabbits.
lately it's been a lot of grandmothers feeding large cats, which I actually adore, but that's neither
Yep.
here nor there. So Jake, this has been fun. Thank you. And for all of you who are either watching or listening to this, this has been Impact Point, and please go to q2impact.com or on whatever platform you're using. We would love to hear from you. Suggestions on future topics, future guests, we're already working on some topics in the future that we got from feedback. So thank you. And Jake, as always, thanks a lot. It's been fun, and have a fantastic day, evening, night, wherever you are. Thanks.
Rob, thanks so much for the chance to talk. See you soon.